All right. Hello and welcome. I'm going to allow a few minutes here. So we're just going to allow one more minute to allow others to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, looks like we have a good group of folks that have joined, so thank you, everybody. I think we'll get started here. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll do kind of introductions and agenda to start with. Thank you, Steve. So thank you all for being here today. My name is Matt Dufresne. I'm a managing director with BDO's Cyber Resilience and Risk Practice. And I have with me Steve Taylor, and we'll do full introductions here in a moment. We wanted to take some time today to talk about the cyber threat landscape and incident response and crisis management and how to integrate those for better overall cyber resilience. And then we'll talk through a couple of case studies. So really the objective of the webinar here is to talk a bit about how incidents evolve. Cyber incidents particularly can evolve up into crises, and how that integration works, from a escalation process, and then kind of connecting to downstream functions of business continuity and disaster recovery and crisis response and all of that to work through the event and then return to normal and all of that. And we'll round it out with, like I said, a case study or two, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. But just by way of introduction, I've been in the cyber resilience and operational resilience space for about 25 plus years now. I spent a good chunk of time with Deloitte and KPMG and Morgan Franklin Consulting prior to joining BDO just under a year ago. Steve?
Thanks, Matt. I co-lead the cyber resilience practice with Matt at BDO, coming on board after spending the prior 4 years at Palo Networks, where I led their crisis incident management capability. And then prior to that, many years at Deloitte and KPMG, working a variety of advisory and consulting practices.
Thanks, Steve. So just a word about questions. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we will either address them as we go or at the end, probably at the end. But if there's a particular relevant question to a topic at hand, we might address it at the time. But we do want to allow room for questions at the end. So if you have them, feel free to drop them in. And if we don't address them during the presentation, we'll loop back at the end and go through questions. So to start with, we wanted just to kind of paint the picture of the state of cybercrime today. And this slide is actually from the end of last year. So you can read the predicted to be 9.5 trillion in cybercrime costs in 2024. I'm not sure where that exactly netted out to be in terms of the actual, but I'm sure it was pretty close. And the point here is order of magnitude, right? So you think about the state of cyber incidents and attacks today. It is relentless and kind of unprecedented and never ending, right? State of attack. So they take that roughly $10 trillion. If you think about that differently and measure it at the state of an economy, cybercrime would represent the world's third largest economy behind the U.S. and China. So that's a fairly powerful way to look at it in terms of the scale of the problem and really the need to for all organizations to have cyber top of mind, not only from a security and controls perspective, but more importantly, almost is from a response, resilience, recovery, and crisis management perspective. And we only expect the damages to grow. Unfortunately, there's a lot of groups out there that are predicting 15% year-over-year growth, roughly for the next 2 years. And if you think about that, if you look at the decade, if it does end up somewhere around 10.5 trillion. I mean, that's up from 3 trillion in a decade. So it really shows the scale of the problem that we're all dealing with. And these bullets below just kind of give a little bit of perspective on what's driving this up, right? It's very opportunistic. Obviously, it's not difficult necessarily for bad actors to probe and attack companies when security controls are weak. We're going to talk a lot about third-party involvement in this as well, and as a conduit from a supply chain perspective, that expanding attack surface is creating a lot of that as well in terms of just providing the mechanisms and the abilities to get in. Ransomware, remains a significant threat. I think over the last 2 years, and we'll talk about a couple of incidents specifically throughout the presentation here, but I think we've seen a tremendous uptick in the last, say, 2 to 3 years, at levels that, we previously hadn't seen in terms of ransomware and, in industry kind of sector-wide attacks, things like CrowdStrike and others that we've seen that are really, driving, connected impacts across sectors that are impacting, multiple business and multiple stakeholders. And cyber incidents are really considered to be, the top cause of interruptions these days on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, there's natural disasters and other events that can spike in certain areas. But if you just look at the probability of events and the volume of events that are happening, cyber is top of mind for everybody these days. That's just a little bit to set the stage of the threat profile and the crime landscape that companies are navigating today. Next slide, please. All right. So where are these threats coming from? It really, the list is broader than this, of course, but we wanted to highlight a couple of the areas where we see, a significant uptick in the last few years and where we perceive there to be, continued threats to organizations and where they might be coming from. So ransomware and data extortion, we've talked about, and we're going to get into that with some of the examples, but, we're really seeing, a large shift, moving to, maximize disruptions and impacts across infrastructure, across sectors. So, things we've seen recently, like Change Healthcare and CrowdStrike that I mentioned, have a little bit of a different flavor than, past, where like banks would be ransomed and things like that, which was, not mainly for financial gain. That financial gain is still there for sure, but, there's a lot of other motivations as well, coming from nation states, APT groups, things like that are really looking to disrupt critical services and bestow economic impacts, negative, and just disrupt life in general for companies. A lot of the vectors getting into that coming through third parties, so the supply chain attacks, so like really taking advantage of organizations that may be smaller in scale or not have the same level of resources as their large enterprise partners, and their attack surfaces further expanded because of those partnerships, and if those security if there's weaknesses in the security control environment of those third-party organizations, that could result in an easy conduit to get into a more secure organization, and then from there move across and gain lateral access and things like that. SolarWinds and Kaseya breaches were a good example of this in terms of a pure supply chain compromise. I mean, SolarWinds was pretty ingenious to embed the malware into their product and ship it out to all of their customers that thought they were protecting themselves, but in reality deploying malware. So really being cognizant of your third-party risk management kind of posture, and your attack surface and where those supply chain threats might be coming from is really imperative today for all cyber teams to be thinking about. Social engineering, a lot of these that we're going to talk about in terms of some of these incidents we'll highlight, gained access through social engineering, phishing, vishing, or smishing, which is SMS-based phishing. I think we've all, as just individuals, have lived through this evolution. We're seeing now, the volume of these attacks. I mean, I just personally see them in my email and my phone or my text, just continuing to just drive up in volume and scale. And that's usually a weak point and a way for bad actors to exploit the human weakness and try to gain access to information they shouldn't have, that then they use to either social engineer an attack or directly engineer a technical exploit or attack through the information that they've learned through social engineering a victim. Cloud and SaaS exploitation. So we've continuing to see massive movement into the cloud and away from on-prem, and moving more towards SaaS application, cloud services, cloud environments. Threat actors are increasingly targeting these environments. Data breaches are resulting from unsecured storage environments or misconfigured access controls. Just an extension of that IT environment that might be moving a little too quick and not being applied the same level of controls or accepting default configuration settings, things like that. So for any new deployment, we always advocate go through the right level of due diligence, whether you're deploying a system internally or you're turning on a service from a third-party provider. Make sure there's good due diligence and security assessments that are going on to make sure you're not, opening up a conduit or a attack vector, if you will, inadvertently. So it's just some of again, the list is broader than this. These are just some of the areas that we see a lot of activity around, and things like social engineering is never going to change. People are always going to try to exploit other people to get information, to use for nefarious purposes, unfortunately. And, supply chain attacks and APTs, these seem, ransomware and some of the other exploits are, driven through some of these groups and ways in. So, I think those areas will continue to be a focus, and resilience teams and cyber teams should continue to evaluate those critical third parties and tease out different, exploit potential scenarios or incident disruptive scenarios through exercising and simulations and things like that. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, some additional challenges that are impacting this. Generative AI continues to evolve. I think we've all lived through that as well. Probably seen that personally and at work over the last couple of years, of course. And what it's helping on kind of both sides, the defenders and the attackers. I think like most things, the attackers tend to get clever about it first and try a lot of different things. So we're seeing a lot of, kind of automation and scale of attacks as a result of using AI. So they're able to, automate broader attacks at scale, use ML and AI to, quickly research stolen data to, maximize the pain they can inflict by that. We're also seeing bots, out there scraping, powering web scraping attacks and, mimicking human behavior at a scale we haven't seen before. And also I'd say, on the social engineering front, which is really a big problem, the AI is getting very, very good at, mimicking language, even targeted language of like how a specific individual writes, right? If you feed it examples, it can get very good and convincing at, replicating the style of an individual's writing these days. And, they're very good at taking advantage of, stress or pressure by trying to get you to click on things at times when they know you're going to be busy and distracted, right? So we'll have to be a little more, I think, diligent and vigilant when it comes to guarding against, phishing and smishing attacks in the age of AI here. One of the other things we're seeing, kind of contribute to these challenges is the constantly evolving regulatory landscape. So I think these are ultimately very good things for the industry that we're seeing, but it's causing companies to kind of adopt new practices, get prepared for compliance around these, and make sure they're on the right side of the reg, right? So just to highlight a few, we saw the SEC cybersecurity rule come out a while back, which was basically mandating disclosures within 4 days of materiality determination. A lot of companies that we've worked with since the ruling have, kind of not struggled, but, given a lot of thought around what does materiality mean? How do we determine that? When do we pull the trigger on that? Knowing there's a 4-day window after that from a disclosure perspective, and building those, that thought process, that decision-making criteria around that really into the incident response process and, the damage assessment process and all of that. To make sure that compliance is being met. We saw a zero trust strategy in 2022, mandating federal agencies complete zero trust tasks by the end of last year, just to improve overall infrastructure approach to access controls and things like that. NIST 2, we're seeing sharpening requirements around security. It's inclusive of more sectors these days and public units as well. So, there's another guidance around, additional security controls. DORA, I'm sure everybody on the call is well aware of DORA and has probably been, working through some level of DORA preparedness. This month, actually just last week, the enforcement started on DORA on the 17th. So we're seeing, companies still continue to, try to get ready and implement operational resilience and be able to, back all that up and showcase it appropriately. And then, privacy regs, we're seeing more come on. CCPA is the latest. We're seeing more and more at the state level too. We expect to go in July, we go into effect as well. So both of these are just kind of adding, to the need for good governance around cyber resilience and good integration, from not only an incident response and emergency response perspective, but also, through the operational resilience and continuity life cycle and, being connected to the right, downstream and adjacent functions, if you will, so that it's a coordinated and holistic, response to these events versus siloed and piecemeal and chaotic. Next slide, please. All right, so this just highlights a couple of them. I mentioned some of these already. I won't go into too much detail. We do have a case study later on around CDK that we'll talk about, but these were all kind of unique in that they were very, or at least change in CrowdStrike, in that they really impacted the sector and infrastructure much more broadly than just the target organization, if you will. And like for change, 80% of U.S. hospitals and 60% of pharmacies, claimed that they were impacted from a claims processing perspective. Think about it, 80%, one one incident impacting 80% of US. It's just massive, right? It caused delays in all of what you see there in terms of billing, patient care, pharmacy. Like pretty much all of their daily operations were impacted significantly. They've estimated over $6 billion in delayed payments due to submission drops and claims and things like that. And really, I think change was the first that really put into clear perspective the connected impacts that can result from some of these attacks, right? And then we saw that also amplify from the CrowdStrike attack, or sorry, not attack, but the CrowdStrike incident, right? It wasn't an attack more than a failure, but it resulted in multiple industry failures. I'm pretty sure everybody saw that and lived through those days of news and seen Delta Airlines and people stranded in the airports and blue screens of death everywhere. So just another good example of how a concentration risk, if you will, one either exploit or failure or problem can lead to sector level type incidents and impacts, right? And MGM, just to circle back on that one, was interesting too. I think what makes that very interesting to me, Caesars, their competitor down the street, had a similar incident. I think the week or 2 weeks, very, very close to the MGM one, just within 2 weeks. And they chose to pay the ransom, and they had a very different outcome than MGM, who chose not to pay the ransom, and they experienced all of the disruption and downtime. The Caesars ransom, I think, was $30 million, if I remember that correctly, and I think the MGM estimated damages was upwards of 100 million or beyond. I don't remember the exact number, but I mean, I just bring that up to just if you're looking at it from like a economics perspective, like you might think, well, 30 million payment, save a lot of pain later, but it also sets a precedent and a tone for those attackers, and you might get hit again, or you might get your data stolen anyway or sold anyway. So it's a pretty thorny problem, but I think it's an interesting case study to see how both of those organizations responded and the implications that came from it. But all of this is just to reiterate the point of we're facing unprecedented challenges and threats from a cyber perspective these days. We're seeing the need to integrate cyber resilience into operational resilience continuity programs, ITDR programs, third-party risk management, just a lot of these areas. And now we'll pivot over. I'm going to hand over Steve, and he's going to talk a bit about integration around, incident response, escalating up into crisis management and some of the considerations around all of that. Steve?
Thanks, Matt. I think we will agree that these four situations all rose to the level of a crisis, but they all begin as incidents, and they begin as kind of their own individual swim lane into a much broader response effort. And really what I wanted to cover today is, when do incidents actually become a crisis? In my past life, I've worked for organizations where they treated the majority of incidents as a crisis, treating it in a scenario where if everything is a crisis, then nothing is a crisis. And so it's really having a good delineation between the two to help clarify when do you actually need to activate, when do you need to mobilize a much larger cross-functional response, and also need to think about beyond just a potential security impact, but the wider landscape of legal, regulatory, financial, operational, and reputational. So going to get a little academic here, but over the last year or two, I've spent some good time working directly with ISO 22361, just understanding what is truly the difference between an incident and crisis, and just thinking about what are the characteristics that make an incident, something a bit lower profile, lower risk, but something that still requires, response and in fact, plans behind it. And while crisis is something that is larger scale, less predictable, as well as may have cascading or catastrophic impacts for an organization. And just really what I'm on screen here is really just that predictability, incidents, things that you typically see, if you're in a security operations center, it's things that you'll see hit your SOC pretty consistently. But really a crisis where you have really unknowns in terms of how they got in, how they actually stole the data, how are they actually exfiltrating, or how they actually moving around and laterally in the environment. These are things that are a bit less predictable, but also things that require a bit more of an adaptive response beyond just looking at your traditional TTPs and your incident response book, our playbook. On set, this is something where you have a bit, no notice or short notice, things that you can still track or monitor directly through your security operations or other types of monitoring capabilities. Crisis is something that's a bit more of that no notice or could actually due to a failure in incident response. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but this also curtails more into the velocity of a situation where you actually have the opportunity to take preparedness activities or preventative measures versus being the full reactive state. Impacts from an incident standpoint are usually more isolated to a specific function or segment of a business versus the full enterprise. Well, a crisis, again, is really that enterprise level impact. And there could be, again, things that are broad operational, reputational, legal. As we saw at CrowdStrike, again, CrowdStrike not a cyber event, but again, it's something that had that operational impact that crippled a variety of businesses, creating not just the legal financial, but also reputation in a variety of cases. Crisis has that public perception issues, while incident could be more of an internal situation or an internal reputation to keep your internal employees or stakeholders apprised, but also it doesn't get that public perception. And just going back to the earlier piece about the predictability, with manageability, with incidents, you have the opportunity to create scenario-based or all hazards, plans, procedures, knowledge bases. Crisis, it's really you have an overarching plan with maybe some impacts and protocols, but it's something that you need to really be able to adapt to ambiguity. And these are really just kind of the fundamental difference. But also, as you look across, a variety of incidents that we profiled earlier, those are situations that may have started as something that was being investigated by a CERT, but proliferate very quickly into a crisis. And it's having predefined triggers ultimately allow you to really go through that transition. And again, not to be academic, but just wanted to share things that we've seen as prospective triggers. It could be one of these, it could be all of these, and there could be specific quantitative thresholds behind it. Operationally, it could be system downtime, and you may have it at different levels where it might be 0 to 1 hours, it could be 4 hours, it could be 24 hours, driving either a customer impact or a broader systemic impact across an industry. Reputation is usually the one that you feel first because it drives public perception, and it can create negative reaction from the market, as well as loss of stakeholder or shareholder value. And these are things that feed into other types of impacts like financial loss. And then more importantly, given that we live in a very interconnected world, it's really thinking about the domino effect of if you're a provider to a variety of organizations, it could have a situation where if your availability or your services are interrupted, that could cascade to other organizations, and you need to go through the disclosure or the response, as well as notify different authorities and regulators. So we work with organizations that define these types of triggers, but also have different quantitative thresholds, and those are usually aligned to what you would see from an ERM perspective, really looking at it from that cascading effect perspective in different levels. But these are things that would really push the needle from that siloed incident to something that is proliferating to something bigger as a crisis. One topic I've also been looking into, and just something that I've had to embrace in my past life, is really about incident velocity, and this is something that drives your response efforts, as well as activities that you could take to either posture for a potential crisis or get thrusted immediately into a response just based on how fast it's moving. And I think we can see this and apply this to not just cyber situations. We can do it with anything that we see from a natural hazard, man-made event, hurricanes. Sometimes you have a bit more foresight to actually take steps to respond and prepare versus react in more of a response per standpoint. So incident velocity is something that you need to embed into your capabilities, but also these are things that really throttle the response effort. And just thinking about if you're building in your cyber response capability and integrating that with crisis management, this one thing to consider. I've seen in the past where you could have an incident where it takes 6 weeks to complete the investigation. And at the end of the investigation, that's when you ultimately determine the impact. That's when you actually activate crisis. You may actually want to evaluate it much earlier during the initial investigation or at the start of the investigation, the posture that there could be a larger impact at the end of it. So it's really throttling incident velocity to really drive your response efforts, as well as to think about we could actually minimize the impact if we take steps more from a preparedness standpoint, given that we have visibility to some of these other externalities. And really building an integrated capability, comes with benefits and challenges. I worked with an organization where I had to work across 60 different incident response teams. Each of those incident response teams very siloed, and what we had to do from a crisis response or crisis management perspective is work horizontally, work cross-functionally, break down the walls of those silos. And realistically, if you're going to build an integrated capability, you have to think about how do you operate not just across each of those verticals, but work horizontally, as well as have the appropriate connective tissue to your executive stakeholders and executive leadership team. But if you have integrated capability, it allows for faster decision making. It has the ability to resolve incidents that might be higher velocity. It allows for unified messaging, as well as if you're going to put out a message to your internal employees, stakeholders, customers, make sure that you're aligning with a single source of truth, opposed to putting out fragmented messages that create additional reputational challenges. If you have an integrated capability, it goes back to really having better differentiation between what is an incident and what is a crisis, and being able to ultimately build that into your playbooks and having the right ability to align your functional playbooks or plans into the broader crisis management plan, as well as having those predefined escalation triggers. I've worked with organizations where if you look at every incident playbook or incident response playbook, it will have SEV 1, SEV 0, it'll have P1, P2, high, medium, low. That lexicon, you need to make sure that it aligns to a degree with your crisis management thresholds and having the appropriate handoff and escalation criteria built in. And this is really about having that built into the integrated capability. And coming out of it, it's really that proactive planning. I've seen organizations, do lessons learned, but it's more, team by team, and it's not looking at it again horizontally. So it's not just about the reactive response, but it's also coming out of an effort. It's looking at how do we need to actually evolve our capabilities to adapt to ambiguity of certain situations. I highlighted, some of those challenges, but one of the biggest things that comes across is really that harmonization. It's one of those things where you could have playbooks that again are developed with very technical focus and don't really integrate with crisis management or the broader library of incident response capabilities. So it's just making sure that they can talk to each other and they have that kind of Rosetta Stone to cover if a P1 is a priority 1 incident in the security and incident response plan, that it has the appropriate escalation and hand off the crisis. So it's making sure that those create kind of that unified activation and response. And then also just going back to the single source of truth, you want to have really that single source of truth for not only the fact-based updates, but also deriving the crisis communications and feeding into that. And sometimes when an event proliferates from a security incident response to a crisis, it's keeping the circle of trust very tight to that need to know basis. And so it's making sure that these are predefined in your response capability, and it's also set forward not only in the response plan but also in the crisis management plan. And obviously one of the constant challenges I see is usually functional teams really want to think about the technical resolution, getting back to a normal state, keeping things contained. And if you're a broader crisis management, it's going to be focused more on the reputational concerns, public perception, losses of shareholder value. And so it's making sure that those priorities are built in and communicated across. And so it's just these are things that create challenges, but if you can address those challenges, you'd be in a situation where you have a true integrated capability. Back to you, Matt.
All right. Thank you, Steve. So now we're going to talk about a couple of case studies. I'll cover the first one and then hand it back to Steve for the second one. This first one is really dealing with the CDK issue. Go ahead, Steve, flip the next slide, please. So, this was CDK. They make dealer management system software, right? That pretty much everybody uses, right? So it's it's single point of failure, arguably for most dealers. And we saw this play out when the incident hit. And I was actually personally at a dealer when it happened. I had service appointment for my car. I literally walked in, and the service, thinking I'm going to drop off my car, and he's like, "Sorry, we can't do anything. We have no access to anything, and so we can't see your records. I don't know what you even signed up for service. Like, I don't know why you're here. Nothing, right?" So I got to see that both from a consumer perspective and from a professional perspective of how this played out. But this was really such an integral piece of software for all of these dealers. When it went down, the effect was large scale and swift, right? It happened fast, and the CDK certainly activated crisis management because of this. It was a pretty quick, I think, evolution of incident to crisis in this case. The impacted crisis, they immediately took data centers and systems offline to try to contain the threat. They went into crisis comms mode fairly actively with outreach to advise dealerships of the situational status and what's going on with the outage and what steps they were taking to help recover quickly. And they did perform extensive testing prior to restoration of applications. That did extend the downtime for dealerships a bit, but it also was a necessary step, I think, to make sure that the system integrity was where it needed to be before they turned everything back on. Go ahead, next slide, Steve. So some of the impacts, mentioned some of these already, but a lot of the essential dealer functions were not available, right? This is all enabled through the DMS system, inventory tracking, sales, parts, service, all of these major dealership operations were impacted to the point where if some dealers had manual processes that they could use, they did. Others we saw just sent people home and they just decided to wait it out, close the dealership. Both bad options. Manual much better if you had built that out ahead of time. You don't really want to be figuring that out at the time. I'm sure a lot of folks here are probably resilience minded, so that's preaching to the choir. But we want to, and I think that from a workaround perspective, the need there is or the lesson there really is, let's dust those off. Not only this industry, but all, and as part of your regular change management or maintenance on your continuity plans. Make sure that you're getting to the right level of detail, and it's not just check the box. You're really checking for the validity of those plans or those manual processes and the sustainability of them. We see this not only in this industry, but others as well. You think any industry that, built continuity plans or downtime procedures that were expected to be, last for a couple of days or so. We're seeing a lot of push to extend those now to, weeks, if not a month, just to deal with the data threat, right? Ransomware threat, data integrity, data destruction, all of that kind of thing. So I think the lesson for dealerships here is, you absolutely have a single point of failure and, strengthen those manual processes. And if you can diversify, but I don't know how achievable that would be in this particular case, given their market share of that particular DMS system. But in terms of the solution, they really, I mentioned already, they shut everything down. So they did, try to contain very quickly. They disconnected, VPN connections. They tried to, kill all of the connections to any conduits, flowing back and forth between the dealer systems and headquarters, if you will. They did, test, I mentioned this earlier, extensively, all of the systems. Which did extend the downtime a bit, but again, I think it was the right thing to do. And they were in communication with the dealers, so they handled that, well, in terms of staying on top of the comms. So in terms of, ultimate lessons learned, I think we hit on these already, but this isn't just another one of a third party, conduit that was so embedded, such a critical piece of infrastructure for this sector that we saw, at this massive scale of impact across, upwards of 15,000, businesses in the form of dealerships across the country. So clearly, whenever we see single points of failure, we look, for ways to mitigate those. If you can, if you cannot, then absolutely strengthen, the continuity plans and plan to have offline capabilities, plan for extended outages, like, mentioned earlier, and, really extend that to look at, several weeks of potential outage. Increased scrutiny on third-party risks and tech. We've hit this a couple of times, throughout the presentation. That's probably the one thing I would hammer the most these days is really, integrate that third-party risk into your cyber and your resilience program so that it is informing, where those critical vendors are, what level of security posture they have, how much assurance are they providing your organization of that level of readiness, if you will. And, just making sure that you have the right, strategies and plans around dealing with, very critical vendors, that are really enabling your business, and looking for ways to diversify the strategies or backups around that. And then, the primary backup, offline immutable back. So, cyber resilience, cyber recovery strategies here, really looking for immutable data sets of the most critical, digital assets, if you will, for the organization, having, air gapped or vaulted, ways of recovering that, or, building in, some of the newer cloud-based tools, things like Rubrik and Veeam and those kinds of tool sets to, add an extra layer of data resilience and be able to recover, your most critical data sets in the event of a cyber attack or a ransomware issue. All right. Next one. Back to you, Steve. Steve? Yeah, may have a hiccup. If you can advance the slide, I'll talk about it, Steve.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay.
So I actually had the opportunity to connect with the organization that was directly impacted by CrowdStrike. And so it's kind of a unique use case or case study where one CrowdStrike was in full crisis response on their end, very transparent on what happened. They provided a variety of things from an RCA perspective, as well as regular communications. Organization I connected with, their insurance provider, they experienced essentially boot loops on 6,500 of their endpoints. It crippled their customer-facing operations, prevented them to process claims. This was a situation where they initially activated security incident response. Luckily, they had direct updates from CrowdStrike that this was due to the content update. So they were able to pivot to more of a crisis response with the cross-functional, what they refer to as a tiger team. And this was kind of a demonstration of their integrated capability, where just having that cross-functional engagement and response, they were able to spin up kind of a minimum viable for at least for their customer facing. They pivoted more to self-service in their support portal. They did a variety of things to at least provide certain updates to customers, but the reality is they couldn't operate at the level that customers would expect. They worked extensively to get the updates applied and ultimately fixed, but it did take about 5 days. And for them there was a variety of learning, specifically on while initially out of the gate they had good integrated capabilities, it still was a situation where they didn't really know how to adapt to the ambiguity of the situation, where they were running into impacts not just in being able to pay claims, taking claims from customers, but also they just saw a distinct drop in satisfaction. They saw the backlog grow, where the interesting thing for them is for every hour of backlog that they had and moving to more of like paper processes and workarounds, it created 4 hours of work to get it back into their books and records or a system of record, as well as really when they activated business continuity as part of their broader crisis management response. It was really about not how quickly can they activate and respond, but it was more how long can they go. And it was a situation where the workarounds that they had, it really was only sustainable for 4 to 8 hours, and they hoped to build it so it could last 4 to 8 weeks. And so the reality is they had to really think about how do they stress test on a go forward basis. Coming out of it, they have a variety of learnings. Going back to what Matt said about the third-party component, it's not just about knowing, what services your third parties are providing, but also maybe in some cases the fourth parties, where they could be, pushing, updates. They could be pushing things to your IT environment, and you may need to have stage gates to make sure that it's not just going to be pushed out across your environment. You may need to actually install, test it, then pushing it out. But also thinking and investigating ways to build in capacity. So the situation where they had only, workarounds available for 48 hours, it's thinking about how do we scale up very quickly with some level of surge capacity to avoid, employee burnout, employee dissatisfaction, the growing backlog. So these are things that, they really had aha moments on when they were doing their debrief and really taking a step back on how did this happen, how can we evolve from here, and what can we do better. And that's kind of a segue into the, really the next piece is, going beyond just the traditional, root cause analysis of the 5 whys or what happened, what can we do better. It's really pivoting the question more to how. And this is really getting into, how can we evolve from this? How can we prevent this from happening again? How did this happen? It's really asking that question and building actual practical steps and things that you can embed into, your response capabilities, your crisis management plans, as well as just things that are looking more across, the full integrated capability opposed to the individual silos. Matt, I don't know if you have any perspectives you want to share here quick.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's just any good, well approached way to get to after action lessons, right? What we're saying here is really look around, maybe more stakeholders than typically, to the 5 why thing that Steve was mentioning. Try to gain additional dimensionality, of the lessons, right? Different perspectives than, maybe in the past you've done, right? Incorporating different stakeholders that may be impacted by some of these broader, incidents, incorporating, even, voice of the customer type of feedback and things like that. In the case of like, if, you impacted a whole industry, that kind of stuff, right? So like there's ways to get, I think, beyond the tradition, but at the end of the day, for all of this, done right, the after action is really your compendium of like, here's kind of where the weaknesses were. Here's what we learned. Here's what we need to do to tighten everything up. And I think the biggest thing on here is the follow through, right? Making sure that, if you get a plan together to try to prevent this from happening again, or at least mitigate the impacts, like, project plan that, like track it. Don't make it a pet project or put it in the back of your notebook to get to when you have time. Like really make sure that that's tracked, remediated, accounted for then in the metrics of the program, and you're kind of showcasing that to show that there's been that change and progress towards more maturity and enhanced capability.
And I think want to echo very quickly what Corinne put in the chat. No situation is so bad that it cannot serve as a good learning opportunity. I would fully agree. And these are things they have to really when you emerge from a crisis. These are the things you have to look at and treat as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, I think you can always find the silver lining if you look hard enough. Was it Churchill? Somebody said, "No, don't let any good crisis go to waste." But sometimes it could just look like it's just too bad, too big, or whatever. But I would challenge everybody to lean in even harder if it seems impossible, because that's probably where you're gonna get to the best learnings if you can dig through it all.
So Jeff, I think we will open up the questions. Actually, I think Christopher, you have one in the chat. How does BDO assess disruptions and threats imposed by agentic AI software? Don't know where to begin, Matt.
I'll take it. Yeah, that's a good one. So we're doing quite a bit of these today in terms of looking at AI, kind of security reviews, integrity of the model reviews, governance of AI is always a part of that these days, and kind of even starting with that. Steve's working on something around shadow AI. Like there's a lot of moving parts right now around AI. And I think a lot of companies are really struggling to like, hey, how do we get our heads around this thing? And, so what we've started with a few clients, that have kind of come to us and we start talking about this is really looking at, well, let's take a step back. Let's look at your AI strategy as a whole. Let's look at governance. Let's look at how are you extending your current security control base into the models. So, for example, if it's not getting treated like any other system, and there's a due diligence security review, and you're extending the right level of controls, everything from access and identity to data integrity controls, privacy, all of that stuff, right? We're looking at integrity of the systems, how to prevent poisoning into the models, and how to deal with it if that happens. How can you get back to good data sets, things like that. And then really looking at the specific, if there's any nuanced security that needs to be done specifically to the model, is in like addition to the broad, kind of corporate security stuff that's already happening. So that's how we've started to approach these, working with a few clients, and then out of that, I'll try to wrap it up. I see there's some questions. Good, but out of those learnings, you usually get to better governance, more of a kind of a roadmap, if you will, to secure those models, and then put them into the regular kind of third line review process and all that. So hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, no, I'm currently writing a white paper right now on shadow AI. It's basically shadow IT version 2.0. Been working with a variety of clients right now. It's interesting. They're looking at their CASB and other things to look at ingress egress from different, just like SaaS-based AI tools that business users are, using just part of their day-to-day or to supplement their day-to-day, and ultimately it's creating, data leak and data breach, opportunities or issues for them. So it's really curtailing that and also building the governance around it, as well as finding ways to actually block the ability to use such tools. So it's just a very unique problem, not beyond just threat actors using it to enhance the sophistication and volume of their attacks. It's also something that could just be unknowing by traditional business users. Matt, I know we just got one. How the BCM testing should evolve with DORA?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is evolving, the approach. What I've seen mainly is rooting those exercises and testing around like value stream maps or critical business services. Most of our clients that have moved well into DORA have kind of organized their their capabilities, their like life cycle capabilities, if you will. Think risk, BIA plan, strategy plan, all that stuff. But centered it more around those end-to-end critical business services tied to processes and asset requirements and dependencies and broader sector stuff and impact tolerances and all of that. So we're kind of looking at it more from integrated exercises across those value streams or critical business services, and then teasing out simulations that may have like industry level impacts, like some of the examples we gave there, to see that if that preparedness from a DORA perspective, is bringing better resilience across the board, and then also obviously learning from those and continuing to strengthen the approach internal and external in the organization around those value streams or those critical business services. Steve, have you seen anything else around that?
I think DORA evolves the notion of do you have a plan? And I'm just taking this from a perspective as a service provider to a variety of banks at the time. We would usually get questions on, do you have a plan? Yes. But the next question would be, how good is it? And it's really getting insight to the testing, the technical validation. And it's also just having the clear delineation between what is an exercise, which is more the people and process focus, versus what is a test, as well as there's going to be various tiers of test. And it's really creating that level of confidence to say, okay, we have a plan, but this is how good it is, and being able to measure recovery time capabilities and being able to articulate that in a meaningful way. So that's one thing I've seen. It's really just evolving the lexicon between exercise and test, and the different things that you convey to either external partners or to customers.
Yeah, also seen an uptick of integrated testing with like critical third parties. Because of DORA, right? You get that more that ICT presence and criticality around TPRM integration there. So like I used to see more of this in the past, but I think seen a bit of an uptick of with your most critical vendors for around a value stream, bringing them into an exercise or evolving to that point if you're not mature enough. If you're starting from a less mature place.
Matt, we have one in from Tasha. I work in oil and gas. We're struggling with how to integrate our emergency response team with IT teams who fix the problem. Any insight or learnings into how we can bring the usual emergency response / crisis teams together with IT?
That's a common problem, isn't it? Or challenge, I should say. I find that a lot. And I also find certain organizations will have different levels of crisis teams, like some that are more aligned with emergency management and physical stuff, and some that are more aligned with, cyber and more operational disruptive things that don't tie to physical assets necessarily. The way I've always done this in the past is try to, show efficiencies and value of tying these things together, couple it with, benchmarking what others are doing, leading practices around the industry, and then just trying to educate, through a series of discussions that try to, are geared around how do we work better together to, respond to incidents, emergencies, and crises, like broaden out the topic a bit, get alignment on the overall, topical scopes, if you will, and then, see where you might start to integrate with what's existing and all the while, enhancing as well, right? And bringing groups together. So that's the way I've done it, kind of, I don't want to say brute forcing it, but, it's socialization, education, showing the value, kind of leading the groups to the outcome, but then also tailoring to what's best for that specific environment as well, right, as you go. But it's kind of it's like a political or social kind of issue as well as a competency thing, I think. So I think, going out and, meeting the right stakeholders, understanding who they are, what motivates them, what's on their plates, and trying to tie that to what you're trying to achieve, and then just kind of iterating through that process to get, hopefully closer to the mark. But that's my 2 cents. Steve, any thoughts from your perspective?
I think oil and gas is very unique because you'll have IT and OT physically and logically segmented or separated. And I think you have to find ways to really not break down the wall, but find a way to bring the OT to the table so that it has a level of commonality with IT, and they also have the connective tissue to emergency response. It's definitely a challenge just based on that can create a very federated or decentralized model, but you have to find ways to hopefully create those dotted line relationships to make sure that things that are happening in the OT environment or IT funnel their way to the appropriate folks at the EMT or crisis level.
Yep.
Matt, we have one in from Steve. Your thoughts on the use of IT/security tools common across SaaS products? How can we as BC professionals identify these potential points of failure? Vendors don't normally share this information with their clients.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I've been encouraging BC professionals to partner with cyber professionals quite a bit recently, and find ways to integrate. In my opinion today, any resilience program should have some connective tissue with cyber in terms of at least from a risk and impact perspective, and then leading up through if an incident leads to an activation of BC plans, IT DARE plans, et cetera, right? What does that mean? So in the planning process to lead up to that, I encourage, even through BIA processes, and when you're talking about these systems with the right IT, or business stakeholders, ideally both, you can start to incorporate, more like cloud security professionals into the mix, and then, have those discussions. So it's kind of a bilateral educational process. I think, cloud security folks can help educate BC peoples on some of the nuance of the, the like default configurations, common vulnerability, like things like that are pretty much, there's a lot of, knowledge base around, but BC people don't always, have that knowledge that's coming from more, IT operations folks or cloud folks or security folks or what have you. So that's what I think is the most impact. Like, find the people that have the knowledge inherently available to them, make friends, partner, and then start to tie those programs together a bit so that, if there's an outage of one of the SaaS products, like, the BC plans are accounting for that. And you can also simulate those in exercises, right? And then have those people come in to participate in those exercises and tease out some of the technical nuance so that in the AAR, maybe one of the remediation aspects is like, full security review of a particular, cloud-based or SaaS system, and, make sure it's compliant with policy and standards that are expected, and remediate if there's gaps, things like that.
I think one of the most fascinating thing is when we work with organizations, we ask them, do you have an IT asset management register or CMDB? And they say yes. What's your level of confidence and how good it is? And it's very low. And it's always interesting when you do, or you connect with the security team and you look at things that are connected to the network, or you run scans using tools like Nessus, and you realize that your CMDB probably covers 500 feet of a mile. So it's those things where, as Matt mentioned, making friends with InfoSec to help provide that visibility, because InfoSec will have a better view on the attack surface, as well as they might have other tools like a CASB that looks at all of the SaaS connections across the company, and that can help add further details to the CMDB that you're working with. So it's just a situation of it's hard to get that complete and accurate view of everything that might be in your environment. Jeff, I know we're coming up on time and we have a few questions left. Can we continue on, or should we begin to wrap up? Maybe, Matt, we have one in from Corinne. What programs do you use to continue to build your crisis management skills, i.e. building muscle memory so that the recognition/mobilization continues to keep up with the evolving landscape?
Yeah, from my perspective on that one, like, crisis simulations are one of the best things you can do, right? And tease out different levels of pain, public facing, internal, that kind of thing. And just build upon the last ones. Like, that should happen frequently, not like once every couple of years. And those learnings, like we spoke earlier, should really be applied with the express goal of tightening up, your response processes, your crisis communications processes, integrating in notifications with key stakeholders outside the organization, PR, all of those pieces. But that's the thing that comes to mind that works, might have the biggest impact is just a very good, strong kind of simulation process, because you're going to get learnings out of every one of those. I know we're 3 minutes over. We should.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today, but I will pass along the remaining questions, and you can reach out and answer them via email.
Thanks, everyone, for your time. We appreciate it.